But the impetus for this discussion was basically what's going on with me right now is I'm actually going off of a medication called Zoloft. And since I'm going off of this medication, I have been experiencing some pretty dramatic withdrawal symptoms. And it kind of relaunched my brain into the overall topic of mental health, SSRIs, antidepressants, anxiety, etc. And this is quite the box. I explored this a little bit on Harley's podcast, like I want to say almost a year ago now, where I kind of talked about my own experience with this particular medication and then my overall thoughts on the issue. And I want to kind of readdress those different things on my own podcast for both my own sake, to kind of remember this point in time and what I was thinking and what I was feeling, and then also to hopefully give some advice to people out there that are also either using antidepressants or thinking about going on them. Because from what I've found, both from a personal and research perspective, there's a large amount of information that is not presented as readily as I think it should be within the topic of mental health and SSRIs. And my own personal experience has been quite evident of that, let's say. And I want to get into that. So let's do an overview on my own personal experience real quick, and then I'm going to get into some of the statistics, and hopefully we'll keep this one a little bit shorter and kind of keep it more succinct. So, but I guess we'll also kind of see where we go. So basically when I was, I want to say, a sophomore in high school, well, we can even go back to freshman year, I was experiencing what I would call dramatic anxiety-type symptoms. And what I mean by that is before any type of a assessment, test, basketball game, any sort of performance that I was required to essentially participate in and be tested upon, I would have dramatic anxiety symptoms for sometimes days before the actual event. So some of them were extreme restlessness. I describe it as always feeling on edge, was the best way to describe it, unable to relax. Another one of the symptoms was difficulty sleeping. That certainly came into the more... That got worse as the event got closer and closer. So, like, let's say the night before an algebra test. Oh, algebra, how scary. I would have trouble sleeping, for sure. And more specifically, I'd wake up in the morning with anxiety to the point where I couldn't really sleep for the last, 2 hours of the morning. Once I got out of that deeper sleep, my brain was preemptively kicking into gear, thinking about math problems. And I remember when it was particularly bad, I would almost enter into, a dream state where I'd be half conscious and would start solving algebra problems in my head while someone is asleep. It was one of the strangest things. It was almost like I was still trying to study. I'd gone the night before to bed studying, and then my brain was unable to stop or at least fully turn that off. So the second I became partially conscious, it would continue that. And I don't recommend trying to solve algebra problems with half your brain activated at 6 a.m. in the morning before the actual test. Is not a particularly good policy. It's actually rather counterproductive. But that didn't really matter. And this is where we get to one of the overarching themes of my own experience, is that I feel, and I think this is pretty true, that I exhausted basically every option at my fingertips before heading in the direction of medication. And that was because I hated the idea of medication. I despised it. The idea that I would need some kind of pill to, just act normally in life was... I just hated that concept. But to take a step back, some of my other symptoms were, I think part of the issue was I was definitely a perfectionist. So I was like, I would get upset if I got like a 98% on a test. And this is the irony, of course, is I had straight A's, and also in high school as a freshman and sophomore, the difference between a 3.8 GPA and a 4.0 is negligible. And yet here I am getting upset about getting, 95s on tests. And it's absolutely absurd because the logical part of my brain knew that me getting upset made no sense at all. And yet I couldn't shut off the part of my brain that was getting anxious. And it was so frustrating because math, logic, reasoning have always been second nature to me to a certain extent. I am an engineer. I find a lot of solace in logic. I'm a big fan of logic. And what was particularly frustrating about this was I knew in my head that my symptoms and my reactions made no sense at all, but I felt completely helpless to my symptoms. And let's go a little bit more into those, I suppose. So sleeplessness, that was definitely part of it. I wouldn't be able to eat basically the whole day. So if I woke up and I had an exam or I had like a track meet, track was horrible. Oh, little funny story here about track. For anyone that happened to be on the track team that's listening, which is highly unlikely. But if you do, you'll remember that we made a video, I'm pretty sure it was sophomore year, where we all said on the video during a track meet, like, all right, look, future selves, we hate track. Don't sign up for next year. You're going to be encouraged to do so. Don't do it. And it was one of the funniest things. I got to go find that video. Quite hilarious. But it was very true. We all despised it. But me especially, because it would just destroy my sleep schedule for the day or two before. And my anticipatory anxiety was just off the charts. So I couldn't eat. I basically felt sick all day. I also felt really weak. Like my whole body would be like super lethargic. I get super fatigued and lethargic, which, isn't the greatest before you're trying to go to a track meet. Not eating, not sleeping, being lethargic, all those things. I still did okay, but I wasn't best at track. So that was particularly pronounced. And then I'm going to get into something that's relatively embarrassing, but it's just true. And this was so frustrating for me, but I had absolutely no control over it. So specifically middle school, it started to get a little better in high school, but even in high school, I'd have this where if I sensed I was failing at something, like let's say that I missed a layup in basketball practice, right? Oh, the dreaded missing of the layup. I would legitimately be so disappointed and have such an emotional reaction to it that commonly I would start to cry, which was, well, let's put it this way. Let's say that you're surrounded by, 14 and 15-year-old boys, and you're the guy that cries on the basketball team because you miss a layup. How do you think that's going to go later on? What do you think is going to happen from a social perspective? Do you think they're just going to, understand you and, really, recognize the fact that it's completely out of your control and that you hate it? Or do you think that you're going to get socially ostracized and be a bloody weirdo? Well, it was definitely the second option there. And I don't even blame them, to be fair. It was strange as it comes. And what was the worst part is no matter what I did, I couldn't stop it from happening. I couldn't. I would spend hours trying out psychological tricks, prepping myself for practice, being like, all right, look, man, you're going to miss some layups. It's not a big deal. I couldn't stop it. It was insane. It would even happen during the dreaded games in middle school, and at the beginning of high school it would happen. And it was one of the most embarrassing things to be as a 15-year-old boy to be crying as you in a basketball game because you missed a layup. Oh, that was horrible. And my logical side of my brain, my algebra side, knew it didn't make any sense, and yet I couldn't do a thing about it. So the culmination of all these symptoms essentially led me to talk to a doctor. And at the time, I didn't really have many symptoms within the depressive dimension. And I've taken several personality tests, and the domain of neuroticism, which is basically proclivity towards negative emotion, I'm high in, like 65th percentile, but I'm not like extraordinarily high in. So it's interesting that I would have such dramatic symptoms while from a personality perspective not being ridiculously high in that particular dimension. But regardless, the reality on the ground when I was 15 was it was untenable long term. I was basically considering just quitting sports entirely because I didn't see a way out, and I couldn't keep living like I was living. And I'm going to get back to this point later, but I want to highlight it here. I did, at least from the perspective of a 15-year-old and the people around me, I did everything that I could to reduce the external factors within my control to solve the problem before I went the medication route. And this is a key point here because I'm relatively convinced, I'm actually certain, that the majority of people that take SSRIs could be doing more with external factors, could be doing more in the working out dimension, could be doing more in terms of working on the relationships with their family, their significant other. It's this classic question. It's like, are you depressed or do you have a shitty life? Because those can go hand in hand, but the combination of a shitty life is almost certainly going to lead to a certain level of depression. And if you're fixed to a shitty life as a pill, you're not actually fixing the problem. It's like a Band-Aid that just keeps getting ripped off every week. So you have to be sure to diagnose the true cause of the problem. And you should look at a pill as essentially the last resort. You should be focusing on the things that are within your control to fix first. Then, when you've exhausted those options, then go to a pill. It's like people go to the doctor and they're like, all right, well, I'm depressed. The doctor starts asking some questions, or the psychologist is, as they should, which is like, okay, well, do you have a good relationship with your parents? No. Do you have a significant other? No. Do you have any friends? No. Do you go to the gym? No. You're overweight? Yes. Do you have a consistent career path, or do you have a consistent job? No. Do you watch porn? Yes. Do you smoke a lot of weed? Yes. It's like the stack of all of these factors. It's not that you're depressed from a clinical perspective. You just have a shitty life that's causing you to be depressed. And if we misdiagnose the cause here, you're not going to actually be able to solve the problem. So back to my own, we'll return to that line of thinking a little bit later, but back to my own personal experience. So I had felt that I truly exhausted all the other options. I'd gone to counseling for like a year, which I despised, by the way. I think my parents forced me, effectively speaking, which you can still do to a 15-year-old. And then, I mean, and this was the thing is, I had a loving set of parents. I had a lot of friends. I excelled in school. I didn't have a significant other, but you really can't when you're 15. Sorry, Holloway relationships. You don't really count. So I had really worked on all the external factors, and yet here I was. So we'll speed it up here. Anyway, I got a prescription for Zoloft. And Zoloft is one of the anti-depression, anxiety medications. They're called ssris, which is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And this one specifically was more curated towards anxiety and depression because they typically go hand in hand. So the theory goes that if you address, even if the medication is hypothetically addressed towards depression, normally it would help with the anxiety dimension. There's less medications that are specifically like, oh, this is anxiety. Most of them overlap, and most are depression that then also help anxiety, is at least the theory. Assuming that we actually know anything about these at all, which, that's questionable in and of itself. But, so I went on this medication, and, it was huge. I mean, it did exactly what it needed to do for me, I'd say. Now, I still had horrible anxiety, which is ironic, but it was manageable. The the extreme ends of my symptoms diminished, like, radically. And I went from being, now this is the interesting thing, here's the catch. I went from being one of the more emotional people in my peer group to the least emotional person in my peer group from all available metrics. There was even a joke in among my youth group that I was, you don't have any feelings. That was a common joke. And, at the time I didn't really think much of it because I was like, well, of course I do. But, I mean, to a certain extent they were right. I had this radical shift over a 2-year period of upping the dose of Zoloft where I went from, emotional highs and emotional lows to effectively an emotional range that varied, that had almost no standard deviation from the mean. And that was quite the change. Now, at the time, that was exactly what I needed because my emotional lows were so out of control that it wasn't tenable long term. But the consequences of this is that you don't really ever experience the true highs anymore. Your version of like happiness or like true meaning is diminished. But the advantage is that your versions of true depression or true high levels of anxiety are also diminished. So it's got this like centering effect, this leveling effect where let's say that your emotional scale is, from 1 to 10, and I would argue, 1 being high levels of depression and anxiety, 10 being, pure happiness and ecstasy. I would argue mine lived between 1 and 8, and then after the medication, I lived between 3 and 6. So it lowered both ends. So I ended up in what I would call a gray territory. And here's where it gets a little bit dark. And I essentially think the medication overcorrected. So this is what happened is this gray area is great from a certain perspective because you're no longer experiencing the insane swings that initially brought you to the medication. But it turns out that sometimes crying's good. Sometimes being really happy is like essential and part of being human. So when you no longer feel like you're capable of those things, something perhaps has gone wrong. And I didn't really pick up on this until, I'd say, sophomore or junior year of college, where I started to recognize, okay, I haven't cried in 3 years. And not only have I not cried in 3 years, but there were times that I needed to cry and should have, but felt like I was not capable of doing so. And that's a big deal because what happened is this gray area that the Zoloft facilitated almost became a new kind of depression. And it was one that was different from what I had experienced in the past, but I'm not convinced it was better. So as the years went on, and now let's fast forward here, now we're in 2023, and at the beginning of 2023, I frankly was fed up with this. I was fed up with the fact that my emotions couldn't seem to represent what I actually felt or what I at least thought I should be feeling. And one of the bigger indications for me, and this is a weird metric, but I haven't cried in like 5 years. Like legit cried. Like actually shed more than a single tear. And that's not normal. And I'm pretty sure that's not good. Specifically because there were times in my life that I knew that I needed to cry but couldn't. And that's not good. So this was building over the course of several years. So finally in January I was like, all right, I'm done with this thing. And I also, for relevant note, I did taper my dose. So I was down to a pretty low dose in January. So I actually thought, like, I'm probably good. I mean, this is the lowest dose you can get. I can't really taper anymore. I'll just go off of it. That went well for about 4 days, and then it went horribly wrong. Probably had one of the worst depressive episodes of my life. And, you know, that's saying something, because I'm not exactly your classic jolly person, especially in college. I tend to be rather dark, all things considered, and how much of that is self-inflicted is a good question. I have a weird combination of personality traits. I'm relatively high in neuroticism, but I'm also hyper high in the intellect dimension, which is not IQ. It's like interest in abstract ideas, and I also have a weird background in the moral dimension. So I was actually attracted to extremely dark literature. So, for example, the Gulag Archipelago, which is an account of the absolute catastrophe of the Soviet Union in horrific detail. Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, he lived through the concentration camps. Literature that essentially dealt with the reality of evil. And, you know, that doesn't... That, and I was also obsessed with nuclear war, which, you know, doesn't exactly make you the most, let's say, sociably excitable person in the room. So, you know, that affected things as well. But I knew that my lack of ability to feel true happiness and true sadness had led to this new kind of depressive state. So, in other words, I went off of it. And again, it went well for a couple days, and then it went horribly wrong. I ended up going back on it, I will admit, because it was so bad that I couldn't really function. And I figured, okay, let's recalibrate. Let's go to the doctor, whom I don't like going to, by the way. And, you know, we'll talk this through and we'll see what he says. So I did a bunch of my own research and we talked it through. And now I'm at 2 weeks of no Zoloft in my system, which, you know, essentially hasn't been the case since sophomore year of high school. So, I mean, 8 years, roughly speaking, give or take. So that's a long time. It's a long time for your brain to make new neural connections. It's a long time of development from the age of 15 to 22, where that entire time you have this chemical, or you have this pill that's hypothetically interacting with your chemicals in your brain. And I say hypothetically because there's some new research out about that hypothetical link between chemical imbalances in the brain and serotonin, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And it turns out not to be as true as we were led to believe. And I'll get into that in just a second. But back to my current situation. So about a week ago... Okay, one step back. So I went to the doctor. He recommended a particular tapering strategy. I did that over the course of 2 months, where I'm already at the lowest dose pretty much possible. But you split it, or you do it every other day, then you split it, then you split that every other day, and you really take your time. So I did that whole schedule, right? Well, I hadn't really done much research into, like, the actual, like, withdrawal timelines. And the doctor didn't even say anything about withdrawals or what I should or should not expect, which isn't a hit on him, by the way. They have like 10 minutes per patient, so, you know, I get it. But it didn't really say anything. So, you know, a week after I stopped them, I was like, oh, I'm in the clear. Like, no problem. Well, then I noticed, like, a day or two later that, like, I was just exhausted. Like, I could barely move. And it doesn't help when you run a landscaping company when you're absolutely exhausted to the point where you can barely move. So I was like, what is going on? So I assumed it was, you know, I didn't have enough electrolytes for the day. I was dehydrated. It was an off day. I was getting sick, whatever. But then it persisted for another 2 days, and a bunch of other symptoms accompanied it, including high anxiety. I was shaking all day like a leaf. Teeth were chattering. Brain fog, like insane brain fog. I could barely think. So all of this happened, and then I was like, it kind of clicked for me. I'm like, oh, what's the common denominator here? It's the Zoloft. Like, that's what it's got to be. So sure enough, I looked into it, and withdrawal symptoms usually take a week to even manifest. And then they normally get worse for a while until they get better. And I was looking into this, and it was something like, what was the percentage of people? I don't know if I found that. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so National Institute of Health suspected that antidepressant withdrawal syndrome is more common and severe than earlier presumed. It affects roughly 30 to 50% of those who attempt to stop their treatment. So 30 to 50% of people have withdrawal syndrome, not even symptoms. It's like, oh, they named it as a syndrome. So it comes with a whole host of lovely symptoms. So, okay, now let's get into the meat of some of this. So, my symptoms, this whole discussion, my history of this all brought me to where we are at the moment, which is I wanted to talk about this and talk about my own experience and be like, for a couple of reasons. One, permanent record for me to look back on from a selfish perspective, which, again, is part of the reason I'm doing this whole thing. Selfish perspective, self-improvement, I get to see where I've been and where I could go. The other reason was I wanted to warn people. I wanted to warn them about what the data says about SSRIs. And I want to talk more broadly about this mental health crisis in America. Because we are dealing with the worst epidemic of mental health in the history of the world, while living in the most prosperous society in the history of the world, in the best time to live in the history of the world. So, what's going on here? This is very strange. And I read a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, and Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote this book. And one of the things that they did is they essentially charted teen girls' suicidal ideation, depression, and anxiety with the introduction of the iPhone. And what they found was a direct linear relationship between those two things. So we live in a time where we are more connected than ever, and yet seem to be more isolated, at least from a mental health perspective, than ever before. So let's get into some of the data here. And the first place I want to start is something that I alluded to earlier, which is that the initial impetus for going on this medication was the doctor said, look, man, you got a chemical imbalance in your brain. People have heard this that have been in this world, this idea of a chemical imbalance, this idea that, like, look, you're not doing anything wrong. You simply have a biological mechanism within you that's out of whack. And we can fix that with this pill. Oh, isn't that convenient? So then you might ask, okay, well, what is that biological mechanism? Well, the theory goes is that your brain uptakes serotonin at lower levels than it should. So that's the theory theory behind these SSRIs, is they allow your brain to take in more serotonin when normally it wouldn't be able to take in the proper amount. So your serotonin levels are off, which will affect your mood, which will affect depression, anxiety, etc. Great theory. Turns out it is no evidence whatsoever to back it. Isn't that interesting? Because SSRIs have been around for decades at this point. So let me get this straight. We have tens, if not, I believe it's, tens of millions of people on SSRIs in the United States. And the primary basis for their proliferation and development is based upon a biological connection that does not exist. Something has gone wrong here. And this specifically is coming from the University of College London, UCL, which did a meta-analysis. It did an umbrella study of, okay, let's actually look at all of the literature that we can find that tries to link SSRIs and serotonin, essentially this chemical imbalance in the brain. Let's try and link these two things. And I'll just read directly from what they found. And the findings suggested that depression is not likely caused by chemical imbalance, a conclusion that calls into question what antidepressants do for patients, according to the authors. In summary, the main areas of serotonin research do not consistently support an association between serotonin and depression, or the hypothesis that depression is caused by decreased serotonin activity or concentrations. So, effectively, and I read the abstract of this meta-analysis, is they found that Most, if not all, of the research into the biological/chemical imbalance hypothesis behind dysregulation of serotonin in the brain is all wrong. That link does not exist. That you cannot causally, with statistically significant evidence, draw the link between serotonin imbalances in the brain and depression, which leads you to question, what the hell are SSRIs doing? Now, okay, here's the caveat. This stuff is complicated. It's not as simple as, oh, okay, then SSRIs don't work. I think they do have their uses. And this is the interesting thing for me, is I'm someone that I would argue genuinely benefited from the use of an SSRI, and then you can debate what it actually did biologically, but genuinely benefited from it in a way that, from a cost-benefit perspective, the pros, the benefits of using the SSRI at that time, specifically, outweighed the costs of it. I don't think you can say that for a lot of people. And more specifically, back to the more important point here, is that I'm concerned that a terrifyingly large percentage of people are on these medications improperly. In the sense that the diagnosis of depression is then linked to a biological mechanism, a chemical imbalance out of this person's control. They're then told by the doctor, look, it's not your fault. This is ingrained into you at a biological level. We'll give you this pill to help solve your problem. I would suspect that the discussion surrounding proactive steps in life, exercise, diet, social situations, friends, significant others, relationship with parents, all of that groundwork, all of that broad life perspective that should be brought into a mental health conversation is not being had. That's just not happening. And, the counter argument would be that it is happening, and it very well might be happening to a certain degree. I would then say it's not happening to the degree that it needs to happen. So, where does that leave us? That leaves us with more mental illnesses in a country, like the greatest level of mental illness in a country that hypothetically should have the lowest given the levels of prosperity that we have. So we get back into this crisis of meaning, back into this crisis of purpose, this crisis of, what are we doing here? Why are we having such high levels of depression and anxiety? So let's get into some of the statistics here about the current state of depression and anxiety in America today. And one of the more terrifying subgroups in this is adolescent girls. And I ran across this the other day, and this is straight from the CDC. That was released not too long ago, which said that nearly 3 in 5, so about 57% of U.S. teen girls felt persistently sad or hopeless in 2021. And that's about double that of boys, and it's the highest level reported ever. And then another sub-statistics of this is nearly 1 in 3 of these girls, about 30%, seriously considered attempting suicide. And that's up 60% from a decade ago. These are terrifying numbers. These are absolutely terrifying numbers. And we need to have a hard look at what's going on here. We need to have a serious discussion about how this has happened, what we can do about it, the why, and very specifically the remedy. If we can't nail down why this is happening, there's no way we can find a solution. So I have some theories, and I think the work of Jonathan Haidt explores some of the theories about specifically the proliferation of social media and the effects that has on specifically young girls. You can look at a bunch of different statistics surrounding body image, surrounding the way in which girls rank each other from a hierarchical perspective on social media in a way that boys don't seem to do to the same extent. If you're looking for more information on the current state of boys and mental health and all those things, Christina Hoff Sommers has a book called The War Against Boys. That was really good. That gave a very holistic analysis of what's going on, specifically in the school systems, how we're effectively trying to socialize and treat young boys as girls, and then when they don't act like it, we diagnose them with ADHD and then put them on Ritalin, which seems like a really bad idea, but we're doing that at large scale right now, which is greatly benefiting the pharmaceutical companies that actually manufacture the Ritalin. So that seems like a bad idea. And then, of course, you get back to the girls, which aren't doing great either, with these rather terrifying statistics. And another broad statistic that I think is relevant here is we had the highest number of opioid deaths in the history of the United States in 2021. That did go down slightly in 2022. And the jury's still out on 2023. But in 2021, we had 107,000 opioid-related overdose deaths. And primarily, most of those were from fentanyl, which, by the way, is coming directly from the southern border that seems to be, very secure for, a sovereign nation that hypothetically should be able to control the influx of people in and out of it. Kamala Harris is on it, though, so I'm sure she'll solve it for us. The very competent White House that we have running the show at the moment. Not to say that the previous one was particularly competent either. That's just it's not a dig against the current one. It's more just let's say, general statement about the lack of competence within the political sphere. Let's put it as that. So we have this massive mental health crisis. And then this is just crazy. I came across this the other day. Here we are struggling like crazy. And then the Amish over here have the lowest levels of suicide, depression, anxiety in America. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here, man? Do I need to get a horse and buggy? Like, what is going on here? But if you think about it practically, it actually makes a lot of sense. They don't have social media. To a large extent, they stay away from most of technology, except for Chainsaw Tuesday and Cell Phone Monday and all those things. I'm just joking here, of course, but I will say on a side note here, the ways in which certain Amish people get around some of their own rules are always fascinating to me. I love it. I mean, I'm all for it. I just think it's hilarious. But back to the seriousness of this point is, I mean, look at them. I mean, they have probably the most robust social circle for any group in America. So they have this massive social network and support network that if they're struggling, they can go to. And social media just it can't possibly replace that. So we've replaced real friends, in-person interactions with interactions almost exclusively online. How can we possibly expect the same level of mental health outcomes and the same level of emotional support when you're talking to someone through a screen or through texting? You can't. So no wonder the Amish are doing better. I'm not quite sure about the whole horse and buggy thing. I mean, I'm not quite sure how that influences it, but something's going for them at the moment. So, that's just a fascinating reality that the Amish are doing so well. Another random thing that I should have mentioned earlier is this came out the other day, and it just goes to my point about the fact that the holistic view of mental health is not taken into account, and so quickly we are drawn to the quick fix with the pill method, where generally speaking, the problem has more to do with your lifestyle and life circumstances than the biology of the way that you're wired. And again, that's not dismissing the possibility that there's a biological component. I think there probably is. Certain people, from a genetic perspective, are more prone to negative emotion. Women are more prone to negative emotion. There's all sorts of different evolutionary biological reasons, sociocultural. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons here, but this was interesting, is that the University of South Australia, they're calling for exercise to be a mainstay approach for managing depression. They did a new study, and it shows that physical activity is 1.5 times more effective than counseling or leading medications at treating anxiety and depression. Which, why that isn't the first line of defense is beyond me to a certain extent. The more cynical side of me says, well, of course it's not the first line of defense because exercise is free. Why would you prescribe exercise when you can prescribe a pill that then facilitates a higher profit margin for this pharmaceutical industry and then lets you keep your job? Do we just want doctors that just refuse to prescribe any kind of medications? You don't think they get any kind of kickback for when they prescribe medications? I mean, I'm not saying that's mainstream, but I mean, there's a lot of weird financial stuff that goes on in the pharmaceutical and doctor relationship. So here we are with a radically free thing that works significantly better than antidepressants, and yet how many people do you think are getting prescribed exercise in a serious way by their doctors, or are forced to show a robust exercise routine and history of doing so before they're even allowed to go on antidepressants? I mean, this doesn't exist. So this holistic view, here's another thing. Vitamin D, you know, that thing that you get from sunlight? Most of America is deficient in vitamin D. Do you know what one contributing factor to depression and anxiety is? A deficiency in vitamin D. How often do you see people shouting to the rooftops, hey, you should take supplementation for vitamin D, or you should go get a blood panel done and see what you're deficient in? That just doesn't happen. One of the reasons it doesn't happen is because vitamin D is basically free. It's not under patent. You can just go buy it. So you have this corrupt incentive structure with money involved. And whenever there's money involved, things get corrupt. So what do we do about it? The same thing with vitamin D can be said about COVID. I mean, I heard the other day that like 90% of ICU patients during the pandemic that had COVID were deficient in vitamin D. These are these low-hanging fruit items that you would think would be shouted from the rooftops by our public health officials, that would be mainstream approaches when you go into a doctor's office, that you get a blood panel and you'd say, okay, what are you deficient in? You know, what do you need more of? Why aren't we talking about fish oil supplementation? Why aren't we talking about magnesium threonate for specifically depression and anxiety? Almost all of these things I've learned not from my doctor, not from mainstream sources, but from people that practice medicine from a more holistic view and are willing to give out information that doesn't directly benefit some corporate office for Pfizer. All right, that's the end of my rant for that one. Okay, final point here is I'm running out of brain. It's per the usual arrangement. I'm just going to blame it on the withdrawals too this time around. The whole running out of brain thing. Back to this broader point about, you know, living in the freest, most prosperous society in the history of the world. On the economic front, it's almost inconceivable how good we have it when you dive into the data. It's not obvious that you would rather be the richest person in the world 100 years ago or the average poor person in the United States today. From what I looked at, it looks pretty clear that you would probably want to be the poor person in the United States today than the Rockefeller 100 years ago with the Carnegies, which is saying something about how far we've come. And on this point of how far we've come, this is interesting, is it's like maybe one of the reasons that we're suffering from such a high level of mental illness is because life isn't hard enough. And this is one of the points that Chris Williamson made a while ago, that perhaps so much of our mental health crisis is because what used to be perceived as, or what life used to be much harder So now the normal things of going to the grocery store and social interactions and having to arrive at a consistent time for your job, and all these things that were very commonplace in the past, or not commonplace in the past, but are seemingly normal things that you would have to do, in comparison to 100 years ago, our life is so easy that these things have now been elevated to the status of very difficult. And this is a phenomenon that I notice when I work out, is that if I work out really hard, my entire mood for the rest of the day changes. So I would say 50% more chill. My levels of negative emotion drop dramatically if I hit a really hard, good workout. And it has to do with this idea, and I mean, Nietzsche got this right. I mean, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There's a great song about that, by the way. Just have it playing in the background. That it turns out that this is kind of the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of at the core of psychology and getting over phobias and addressing issues, is like intentional exposure to the thing that is hard or that you fear is beneficial psychologically and beneficial from a mental health perspective. And so much of modern culture is about avoiding hardship, about avoiding adversity, about trying to live as free from those things as possible, when in fact, when you flip that equation and you say, you know what, I'm going to intentionally expose myself to stressors in my life, you develop a completely new relationship with stress, and it's much more beneficial long term from a mental health perspective. And I've noticed this in dramatic fashion with the gym, with approaching life. One of the things that I've noticed over the past couple of weeks in the business that I run, that so much of the negative emotion I experience when running the business is all anticipatory. It's all the anticipation of doing the hard thing. When I actually get down to doing the thing, it's never as difficult as I imagined it to be. All of that negative emotion and all of that anxiety behind the thing just ceases to exist. And I think that, broadly speaking, is true about life to a certain degree. That I think a lot of our negative emotion comes from anticipating doing something versus if we were to just do it, if we were to just get up, if we were just to, actually accomplish the goal and start pursuing it, we'd find that your overall mental state would improve dramatically from actually just doing the thing and actually just jumping at it and being disciplined in that. Another point here about motivation and discipline, so much of the time, I'm not actually motivated to do something. So discipline is even in those moments where you have a lack of motivation, which for me is most moments, I still do the thing. I still go to the gym. I still get up at 8 a.m. And I think a lot of people they feel like, oh, I need the motivation. Once I have the motivation to do it, then I'll be disciplined. It's like, no. You don't understand. Most of the time, you won't have the motivation. Most of the time, that alarm goes off at 7 a.m. and you're not motivated to get out of bed. The difference is if you decide to do so. And what I've found is that if I decide to do so, all of that negative emotion about the workday ceases very quickly after getting up. And that's not always the case. But generally speaking, it's the anticipation that's the hard part, and the doing of the thing is normally not as bad. So I think I'm going to leave on that note. The dark side of antidepressants is real, and people that are considering going on them, I hope you found this useful, or people that are considering going off of them, or that are on them right now. Think about this seriously. Read up on it. Figure out if this is something that you want to be on long term. Because I never had a doctor say, hey, what's your plan for getting off of this medication? And this is another point here. There rarely seems to be an off-ramp for these antidepressants. Rarely is it, oh, okay, in a year we're going to check in and get a plan to get you off of the medication. A disturbing number of people end up being on these things for life. So are they a Band-Aid, or are you now a medical ward of the pharmaceutical industry? You should really think that through. I hope this has been useful.